Welcome to the Geniuses of Copywriting podcast, a peek into the minds and strategies of the world's greatest copywriters, marketers, and persuasion experts. And now, here's your host, Brian Casangina.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Geniuses of Copywriting podcast. It's my privilege to welcome today a very special guest, somebody who I've followed online for a little while. And I've finally got the chance to get her on the show. So I really appreciate you coming on the call today, Sue Rice. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Not a problem. I'm really interested to hear about some of the stuff that you've been working on. We were just discussing a few things before we hit the record button, which are pretty interesting. But I just wanted to drop a few things here just for anyone who doesn't know yet exactly what your story is. So now you're referred to as the female David Ogilvy, which is high praise indeed. You do email marketing, your copywriting agency, and you do all of that stuff. Now it's interesting what you mentioned here is that you started your career at Ogilvy and Mather on Madison Avenue. So that's really interesting because that's a very different kind of marketing than most listeners of this podcast will be into. Most experts who've been on it, we really focus on the direct response world. So I'm interested to sort of hear your story, where you came from, how you got into this field, and how you went from Madison Avenue ad agency, to being one of the preeminent email copywriters in the market.
Yeah, so hopefully I'll be able to do this in a short version. So I started out at Ogilvy, and they have a very famous and very complete training program where I learned a lot of the direct response techniques that Ogilvy is so famous for, as well as sort of the, if you will, the brand advertising side. And so that was sort of, I think a lot of times where you start off provides sort of the foundation. And I've kind of carried that through with me all these years, and then sort of kind of tweaked it for it to make sense with the online world and with the world that we're living in, that's beyond direct response as well, so that the direct response techniques that I use feel fresh. And we can talk a little bit more about that a little bit later maybe, but because one of my, I guess the best way to say it, levels of discomfort for a long time when it came to direct response copywriting was how it felt. It felt a little bit heavy-handed to me, even though I'm absolutely a big fan of what direct response can do for you. I sort of have spent like a long time trying to figure out how to take the power of direct response and make it feel just a little bit more contemporary.
So how do you do that?
So what I started out doing about, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I started sort of wrapping up my direct response messages in stories, right? So I started out talking about stories in the way that everyone talks about stories, which is it's about the story of the company or the story of the person who founded the company. But I found that approach was limited at the end of the day. You can't repeat the same story over and over again without boring people. So then I started experimenting with wrapping up messages in third-party stories. First, they were third-party stories that connected with the marketplace or connected with the person who had created the product. And then I realized that basically any story, even if it's completely disconnected, can make your message so much more interesting. And it's actually when your story is unconnected that by juxtaposing a completely unrelated story to what you're doing or the challenges that you meet for your prospects or the product that you've created, it's when people are like, wow, I never thought about it that way. That's really cool,
Mm.
because by using this sort of what I call the parallel vision, you end up kind of creating a visual in someone's mind, and an aha moment, like, oh yeah, that's what lead gen is all about. Oh, that's what if that makes any sense. So
Yeah.
it's and so I've actually created I have thousands of third-party stories that illustrate some of the classic pain points, the classic challenges people have, the classic objections they have. And I also have a whole, I mean, like, I've literally thousands. And I also have a lot of stories, because one of the biggest challenges people have is between their two ears, right? It's like they worry that they can't do it, or it's not for them, or, the classic. And so the stories that I pick are strategic in the sense that they are making a point that's important for your business, but they are at the same time, I think one of the problems when you open up the inbox, or really even social media platforms, it's like, oh my gosh, I've seen this message 4 million times before. So when you start adding in stories, breaking news stories, timeless children's stories, whatever, when you start adding those in, you really grab people's attention because it's different. And it just feels much more fresh and like, oh, and even if people don't actually click and make an action or purchase right then, it's a way of building trust too, because it's not, it's like I always say to people, if you went to a dinner party, you're not going to spend the whole time talking about your product, right? You're going to talk about what you watched on Netflix, or you're going to talk about what happened in the news today, or right. And and you're going to join in on a collective dialogue. And that's what our copy should be doing too, right? Yeah. It shouldn't always be interrupting. It should be like joining in on the collective dialogue, and yet still being strategic, if that makes sense. So that's sort of the whole system that I've created, and it worked really well.
Yeah. I'd love to hear an example of that, because it's right what you say, first of all, the worst marketing sin, as you know, would be to be boring. And if you're just telling the same stories over and over again, it's unavoidable. And that's one of the first challenges that any copywriter has when they come on board with a new client. They've got to extract all their stories out of them, and to give them ammo to put in the sales copy and everything. But I'm really fascinated by your approach to it, because you've got those thousands of templates with different pain points. So I'm really interested in hearing a simple example of one of those, so we can see what it looks like.
So here's one of my favorite examples. There's a story about a guy who went to the Olympics. Oh, sorry, not the Olympics, but marathon in Stockholm, Sweden, in I might be saying the wrong year, but it's somewhere around 1926. And he started the marathon, and he didn't complete the marathon because he got really dizzy, and he stopped, and he had a drink with someone, and he was so embarrassed. He's Japanese. He was so embarrassed. He just got on a plane and went back to Japan. And 50 years later, the people that were organizing the marathon just found out about this story and invited him back to complete the marathon. And so he completed the marathon in 56 years, 22 hours and 30 seconds or something, right? So it's a cute little story about how he came back. And then, so for example, that you could use that story to talk about time, right? Because one of the big pain points people have is time. And you can say, I promise you, if you come and, the moral of the story is time is of the essence, even if it takes a long time. But when you work with us using our system, I promise you it will not take 56 years to get for you to cross the finish line. I mean, I'm just saying that off the cuff, but that's the kind of thing that And I use what I'm doing more and more. This is something that I'm evolving literally every day. What I use more and more is what's happening right now. The fires in Australia are a good, you could use that as a story because, at the end of the day, if I've understood correctly, there is a natural process that's going on there where the brush needs to be burned away to make way for
new growth.
For new growth.
Yeah.
Now that is a story. Everyone knows about it. Everyone's talking about it on social media. It's everywhere. And you could say everyone needs to do that. We all need to do that with our marketing. We need to do that with, whatever your market is. If your relationships, sometimes we need to prune what isn't working for us in order to make room for new growth. And sometimes it's painful, really painful, just like the Australian fires are. So that would be another example of how you could use, stories that are completely unrelated to, improving your relationship or improving your marketing program. But what they're doing is they're borrowing on a collective dialogue and making your message more pertinent and more powerful, because you're not interrupting what people are thinking about. You're joining into that dialogue.
Yeah.
Now, some things obviously, the Australian fire is a good example. I could use that for maybe a month, but there's some that aren't timeless, right? You only be able. We could use it in, I can't remember where. I guess it was in December mainly. I don't know if they're still going on, but you can't use that particular story forever, but you can use it in a timely fashion, which is also interesting because particularly when you look at emails, which are like little snackable bites of information, is that, you go into your inbox. I mean, seriously, it's like, I felt my eyes just glaze over. Every message looks just like the other one.
Yeah.
So, but if you saw an email talking about the Australian fires, you'd open it. Right?
Yeah.
Particularly if you're Australian.
That hurts, yeah. But there's such a worldwide news story that everybody knows about it. Yeah, because they're so bad. It's received a lot of media coverage.
Yeah, and you can push the buttons as far as you want. I personally don't like the whole Trump story. I personally wouldn't use that story. But there are a lot of people who would be happy to, right? So it's also going to depend on how controversial you want to be. I kind of steer clear of pretty much, some pretty things like the really polarizing political issues, but that doesn't mean other people might feel comfortable with that, right?
Yeah, because I know people who, as well as their email, they're good at posting polarizing stuff on social media, and there's always the two groups that emerge: people who love them and people who hate them for it. So it works for them. I'm more like you, where I don't want to sort of go that far and be that polarizing. But it works for a lot of people that I think we both know on social media.
Yeah, absolutely. On social media and through emails too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of, if you look at someone like Ben Suttle, that's his whole, he wants to be polarizing, which is totally fine. So, if a client really wanted to do that, I'd be happy to do that for them. I just personally wouldn't do it.
Yeah. So it comes down to like, being true to the way you want to run things. Like if Ben Settle was to sort of sit on the fence and not be polarizing, then that would be off the mark with his audience because they're not expecting that. Would you say that would be accurate?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I actually totally agree with him on that, because you can't. It's not. What I'm not suggesting here is that you just pick sort of vanilla stories. I think what I'm saying is that just the fact that you use unrelated stories to sort of that give a parallel vision to what you're doing, just doing that is going to make your message feel so much fresher, right? And feel different and feel, because what's happened, for better or for worse, there's a million templates out there and everyone's using the same ones. And seriously, it's like, you go, the inbox is a mess because it's just filled. I mean, yeah, it's filled with stuff, but there's a reason open rates and click-through rates are going down steadily every year, because it's too much of the same. So but the good, that's the bad news, right? But the good news is you can actually cut through that, and you can cut through it also in social media, because I think the other thing that I like to do is I feel like people silo copy. So we have our sales letter here, and we have our emails here, and we have our social media here, but really it all is just one big circle. Yeah. Right, that we should be communicating the same things, and using the same techniques, and then it all feels really cohesive.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and it's how you bring out these stories in everything you do. How does a person assemble like thousands of these different stories over the years? Just through hard work.
Yeah, through a lot of hard work, and through through a lot of hard work, through working with, I have worked with probably now hundreds of clients in different industry, like every industry you can imagine, from weight loss to finance to, everything. And so, and initially I was always looking for stories that related directly to the marketplace, and then I realized that I could go much farther afield and still get the results that I get, which are like, I just did a product launch with a dentist in Australia, actually, and his open rates over like 30 emails were hovered between 45 to 50%, which is crazy. Yeah, good, but it was because they were interesting, and they, it's not just, you don't just put a story in though, right? So the story is just a way of setting up a piece of content, a strategic thought about, beliefs people should have when it comes to your industry, about beliefs they should have about you, beliefs they should have about themselves. So it's not just a story for story's sake. There's a strategic purpose behind it. I think that's super, super important.
Yeah. So like you move on from the story, and I think, as you mentioned before, you tie that story into whatever the outcome of the email is,
Yeah, for example, that little example I gave of the marathon, right? Yeah. So maybe the objection people have to your product is that it takes too much time. It's going to take me too much time to get results. So you need to start with what you're trying to communicate, and then you wrap them around in what I call my little Tiffany box stories, right? Yeah. So that your story, so that you have a choice between doing that, or you can say, oh, time is not an issue, right? Which is what everyone else does. Yeah. You could write an email saying, I promise you, you're going to do this really fast. Well, I've seen that before. Yeah, I've seen that before. Yeah. Right? So that's why the stories kind of help. And it breaks down, there's a lot of studies about what stories do to your brain, but, it breaks down that resistance, like, oh yeah, they're saying it doesn't take too long. Yeah, I've heard that one before. Right? Yeah. That kind of cynicism, it breaks that down, because, oh yeah, that's weird. That guy did that marathon in 56 years.
Yeah, it's a good point, because one that I've used for years is, many years ago, I did a week of in-person copy mentoring with Trevor Toecracker Crook, and he was in Vancouver at the time. So I flew over there from Australia. Took all day to get over there, and they picked me up from the airport, and we went out to lunch. And he was we went to this cafe, and he was trying to use an American Amex, I think it was, to pay for it. And this cafe in Vancouver, Canada, said that they only accepted Canadian credit cards, and which was ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
But to the point of the story, every time that I use it in copy, and I think Trevor used this often as well, is that are you making it too hard for your customers to do business with you? That kind of thing. So.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect example. And by the way, I don't want to say, because I think personal stories, I mean, I live in France and I've lived here for years, and I have a zillion stories about living here that people love to hear. So I'm not saying don't use your personal stories. Absolutely, it's great. But I'm saying that I feel like the way people talk about storytelling is a bit limited. And so, I encourage people to think about stories in a much a more expansive way, because it makes it, it just makes it really, it makes your communications more exciting, and it makes people really want to read your stuff. You want to be the Andrew chaperone where, when Andrew sends out an email, you always open it, right?
Yeah, I certainly do.
Yeah, so that's sort of, I think, the goal. I mean, the other way of looking at it, because I'm assuming people listening to this know all of this sort of vocabulary. People like, when I look at what Todd Brown does and he talks about big ideas, I see the wrapping of stories like little mini big idea nuggets, right? Because it's a way of looking, it's at what you're doing from a slightly different angle, and a fresh one. And that's what his big ideas are all about, right?
Yeah.
So and the thing that's interesting about it is at the beginning, it's like a muscle. Like when you exercise it, like at the beginning, like, how do you make those connections, right? People always ask me, how do you make the connections? Well, it becomes a habit. So now, I mean, I'm hopeless. Like anything I read, I start making connections about what that message could mean.
Yeah, that brings me on to my next question. I want to know, and for the listeners as well, how do you go about compiling these things? I mean, how do you keep your radar open to pick up these stories? And how do you record and organize them so that you've got this vault of templates to look back on?
So if I could start with that last question first, I kind of want to circle back around to what I was saying earlier, which is that everything needs to be strategic. There are certain points you need to make about the pain points you help people solve, the challenges you help them solve, what they need to believe about you, what they need to believe about their marketplace, et cetera. You need to, that's sort of the starting point, because otherwise you just have sort of aimless stories coming from everywhere. So I have in my story library, everything is kind of organized by the type of pain points that people have. Now I have a bigger story library because I have a whole stable of clients that I'm helping, right? But imagine that the problem people have is they don't have enough time, or they don't have enough skills, or they don't have enough support. Whatever, you have to figure out strategically what it is that people are missing that your product or service fulfills. And then you work from there, and then you find stories that will make sense with those strategic points, if that makes sense. Yeah. So you have to start from the strategy first and then work back. And I'll tell you that I will give credit where credit's due. This is something that Andre told me. But if you go, in terms of sources, you just pick up your phone, right? And you get, like, for example, I have I've got a ton of different apps that, are like sort of news. I don't know what you call them. They're not like, I mean, I do things like BBC, but also there's things like Flipboard. I don't know if you're that app, which has a million different stories on every topic possible. So
they're
aggregates. Thank you. And and you can you can find out the things that you're interested in, but I wouldn't be too narrow. I would, I would go in there and read, take time every day to read, flip through the stories and that's the way I get inspired, through stories that are out there. And there are millions of them. And also just following, please, Instagram, Facebook, that kind of thing as well. But there are a lot of aggregators that will give you a ton of inspiration in terms of stories.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great way to go about collecting these stories, because it's kind of limiting if you are only talking about your personal stories. But what I loved is that you started off with that marathon story, which would be something that you would read in a news article, and that's something that a lot of copywriters would miss out on. So, like you said before, when we're looking for these stories, we can limit ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, I saw a story today, and I don't quite know yet how I'm going to connect it up, but it's a story about a blind elephant that likes to dance to this guy came out and with his piano and started playing music, and the blind elephant started dancing to it. There's a connection in there somewhere, right? So sometimes also you just see a story that interests you, you earmark it, and then and let your sort of unconscious figure out what the connection is. It might not just be automatic, if that makes sense. And then there are like timeless stories. Like there's the famous story of Picasso, where he was in a cafe in Paris, and a woman asked him to do a little drawing. He spent 20 seconds doing a little drawing for her, and she said, "Oh, well, how much will that be?" And he said, "It's going to be, I can't remember, $20 million." And she's like, "It took you 30 seconds." She said, "Yeah, 30 seconds plus 30 years, right?" And that's a story about your real worth. You're not just worth an hourly rate. You're worth all the value that you bring, all the experience that you bring to your product. So there's timeless stories, there's fables, but I really like the stuff that's happening right now, because I feel like it makes people are going to pay attention to that more than anything. Because they're already, people are reading about what's going on in the news today.
Definitely. And I agree with that, because that if they can connect what a story they've already heard, but you now join the dots from that to what you want to sell, then it saves you having to introduce the story. Because if when I just described that story of going to that cafe in Vancouver with Trevor Crook, I had to explain in a few lines, the context of that story, and that's some extra stuff that you can cut out if you're talking about the bushfires in Australia, because everybody knows what's going on there.
Right. And I mean, I also, by the way, I'm not talking about people becoming novelists. Like we're talking max 300 words, right? We're talking a short, and so I think years and years ago, I went to I guess it was kind of a seminar workshop put on by Matt Fury, who is a complete genius, by the way. And basically what he taught, and this is basically what I still use, is you tell a story. It could be a one-line story. It could be a few-line story, but it's not going to be long. Then you tell the lesson of the story or the moral of the story, and then you do a click to action. That's what you do. It's real easy. It's a real easy 3-step formula that will get people really interested in what you're saying. The mistake people make is they assume the story always have to be about them, which is fine. It can be about you. And I would encourage people to include stories about yourself. But what I would also say is that it's much richer than that. And I always come back to the dinner party thing. You don't go to the dinner party and talk about your product. You go to, and you don't go to the dinner party necessarily actually to talk about yourself either. You go to the dinner party to chat about, did you see that? Did you see that story about, right? That's what we do. We're like,
yeah. Well, MLM people might go to talk about their products, but most people don't.
So, but I read I don't know if this statistic is right, but something like 65 to 70% of all our conversation is basically sort of social gossip, right? It's like,
Yeah.
Did you see that? Did you? So yeah, well, yeah, but if that's what people like, we obviously all like to hear that stuff. So let's that's the way we should talk, right? That's the way we should copyright. And that's where I kind of come back to what I said at the beginning. That's what I do to combine with the classic, we know it works, direct response method. So I just wrap it up in that. That isn't to say that direct response is, because I think direct response techniques work really, really well, but it just makes the meal go down easier, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So how do people find out more about you? I know you've got your website, which I want to mention the address of that. So what's your website where people can contact you from?
Yeah, so it's real easy. It's SueRice.com.
Yeah.
And there's a contact form in there if you want to, and I will, if you mention that you heard me on this podcast, just put it in the subject line, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have personally. I also, if you're in the US, I have a text number that you can text me at, and I will answer personally, which is 408-872-9422. And I'd be happy to chat about anything. Whether, if you're struggling with your copy in general, if you're struggling with your email, and I can answer any questions that you might have.
That's awesome, because it's great to have that personal touch where you get a reply from the expert rather than perhaps their virtual assistant. But I think that's really valuable. Anyone listening to this podcast, should definitely take advantage of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I was listening to Tim Ferriss's podcast a couple of years ago. He interviewed, I know he's interviewed her several times. He interviewed Arianna Huffington. She gave her I don't know, phone number or email. And I was thinking, that's so cool. It's so cool, right? Because I mean, I think that's actually one thing that we all forget. We get so busy building our funnels that, sometimes it's just good to just even if it's a 30-second text, or sometimes it's just good just to chat like human beings. You don't have to you don't have to reach out and set up a giant sales strategy call. You can just say, hey, I've got this problem.
That makes a lot of sense. So SueRice.com, and if you're listening on iTunes and you really don't know how to spell SueRice.com, I will chuck a link up on geniusesofcopywriting.com on Sue's page there, so the link will be there. I'll also put your cell phone number for US listeners. So can you repeat that one last time before we go?
Yeah. I don't know if I heard. Hang on one second.
That's all right.
It's 408-872-9422. And I'd love to hear from you. Just say hey, and we can talk.
Yeah. So if you resonated with anything that we've talked about today, definitely get in touch with Sue. There's a reason why we invite only the best experts on these calls, is because they've got plenty to offer. Sue, you are a genius of copywriting. I thank you for your time today, and I look forward to catching up in the States, or next time I'm in Paris.
Yeah, next time in Paris, I'll treat you to lunch in a bistro.
I'll hold you to that. All right.
Okay. Talk to you later. Thanks, Brian. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Geniuses of Copywriting with Brian Casangina. To get the full transcript and all the resources mentioned on today's show, go to www.geniusesofcopywriting.com now.